Folks, are you ready to go live?
Yep.
Ready.
Okay.
Hi, Tanya.
Hi,
nice
Ivan.
to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So today we're going to talk about your lovely book. And I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for writing this, because you've managed in a relatively slim volume to offer a really useful set of terms and definitions and ways of thinking about the relationship between protest and digital media and the internet and technology. And I think what you've done with this book is a very helpful reminder in a time in which the mass media and pundits and many, many policymakers and others around the world have started to broadly vilify citizen-driven media on the basis of the bad behavior of social media platforms and technologies. And your book is a reminder that while the platforms and the technologies are one side of the equation, the people who use them also have a significant impact on what we come to know and understand about events in the world.
Well, I want to first to just briefly say that, thank you for reading the book, because that is basically all any author ever wants, is that somebody actually reads the book. So I'm very glad that, it's resonated with you.
My pleasure. Maybe for our listeners, and before we launch any further, let me say thank you to everybody who's come to listen to us talk on YouTube. And if you're a little bit later on, we'll be having a comment space, and you are very welcome to comment. Please use the YouTube comment section, and we'll see your notes and questions, and we'll be able to respond to them. And we'll remind you of that a little bit later as well. So Tanya, I wonder if we could start, if you could give us a very brief statement about what your book is about.
Well, I'll try.
Okay.
So essentially the main kind of argument and theme in the book is that it's really important when we think about how protests happen today, to think about them as a kind of hybrid or augmented space where things that happen offline and, in spaces like streets or protest camps also are complemented and tangled with things that are happening in digital spaces. So hashtags, Twitter storms, live streams, and that it's really impossible to understand, I think, the majority of modern protest movements and protest events without reckoning with that space that is composed of both atoms and bits. And so for me, that is really the central argument of the book and the central theme of the book. And I think because it's focused predominantly on the Ukraine Euromaidan protests, it's also an attempt to really explain what you just mentioned, that it's people who use technologies and the opportunities or limits for action that they see when they use those technologies that determine really how protests happen. So it's not just the platforms or the technologies themselves, and it's not just the environment, and it's not just the people. It's all those three things kind of combined, and that is really what I tried to show. And I think what is visible when you read the book and when you find out all of the different ways that people in Ukraine used different digital media platforms, and then more, in more recent years, people in Russia, and now, of course, people in Belarus, which obviously didn't make it into the book, but I'm sure somebody's writing a book about that as well.
I'm sure they are. But you chose to write about Ukraine, and I think it would be wonderful if you could explain a little bit about your relationship to this story, because it's also personal. And I think that I mention that now, not just because you have a personal relationship with Ukraine, but because the personal is a big part of the story.
It is. And I think I was as when I kind of first started doing the research that really became the foundation for the book, I was quite hesitant about this because, as in classical sort of social science and communication and political communication, the kind of dominant academic view is that the researcher must always separate themselves from their research, their subjects, their questions. And I found that I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that for many reasons. For the reason that, I'm myself from Ukraine, and I am also intimately kind of embedded into the civic activism and the digital media communities in the country. The protest was a protest that I also identify with as a citizen, and many of my friends and acquaintances and former coworkers, students, colleagues also joined and participated in and analyzed and wrote about it. So it was a really personal, I think, project for me. And I think it also meant that I sort of felt this heightened responsibility, like to do justice to the stories of the people whom I interviewed, and the stories of the protest, and the stories of how and what role digital media played or didn't play in the protest. So it's I think a very personal story for many reasons. But as I say in the book, I think it also means that it gave me certain privileges. So I was able to get people to trust me much faster when they told me their stories, and when I went and did fieldwork and interviews in the protest. And there were also certain things that they almost felt they didn't have to explain to me, but I asked them to do it anyway, because, very often if you have a common sort of set of meanings or understandings about something, people feel like, oh, well, this anyway. I'm like, well, yes, I do, but others don't. So you still have to explain it to me. And I think also there, having been a journalist in the past and not just a researcher was also really helpful, because journalists arguably are sometimes better at interviewing people and eliciting those stories. And I felt stories are really important, right? So the book it's an academic book, and it has data, and it's based on data, but it's also grounded in stories, real stories of people who decided to join the protest and who then made decisions about how to use particular tools to achieve protest goals.
Yeah, so the methods that you chose are mixed methods, and within that mixture is this. You offer, one of the things I love about your book is that you offer a range of terms and almost a vocabulary for thinking about the situation that is very clarifying for understanding the nuances for the relationships that you explore. And some of the words that you use that are relevant here are to enmesh or to entangle, and I find that if your work is about augmented protest, in a way that it's also augmented research, right? Because you are participating in that very same way as a researcher, and also having to do the simultaneous act of researching and witnessing and participating in, I think, what you describe as a tripartite form. And I found that to be fascinating in the way that you yourself become enmeshed and then have to step outside, in the way that everybody is performing these multiple roles simultaneously.
It is, and I think it's also like, it's almost counterintuitive, because when people hear that you're doing work on digital media and protest, they're like, oh, so you're analyzing social media data. And I mean, I do that, but I think it's impossible to tell the whole story without not just analyzing Facebook group content or Twitter content, but you also have to actually go down to the protest square, and you have to talk to people and have to watch and observe how they use or don't use technology, and when they put it down and when they pick it up, because that is also part of that augmented reality, right? So you're looking at the kind of the whole, you're looking at the assemblage, or the whole canvas. And for sometimes, in order to do that, you need to step back and look at the big picture, and sometimes you need to like jump in and kind of roll up your sleeves and actually go and like look at how, like, where are people charging their phones? Like where, and it, because those all of those things are so intimately connected. So it's really impossible to understand the dynamic as a whole without attending to both the material elements of it and the digital elements of it, and thinking about things like distance and time differences for those diaspora members who are participating, but then also thinking about things like, well, what if you're too close to what is happening in the protest square, and the only way you can see the big picture is by looking at your screen where somebody else is live streaming from the other end of the square.
Right, you're in the middle of it, and therefore you can't see it.
Exactly.
Precisely. So let's roll up our sleeves and read a passage about that.
Okay, that sounds really good.
Give us a taste of your prose, please.
Okay. So I'm going to read a really brief passage. This is the beginning of chapter 5, which is probably one of my favorite chapters in the book, and I think it continues the theme of what we were just talking about. It's dark. The camera is shaking, swiveling wildly from side to side. The shot shows riot police pushing people away from the Statue of Independence in the eponymous square, where several dozen protesters were occupying a central spot that night. As the camera pans, the policemen swing their batons left and right, hitting protesters indiscriminately, blows landing on hands, backs, and heads. In the background, people are screaming. Then the camera jerks and the person holding it yelps as they also catch a blow from behind. Suddenly all we can see is the blurry image of the sky as the live streamer slips and falls. When they get back up, the video stream becomes a cacophony of sounds and images. Shouts of indignation and fear, bloodied faces and cradled limbs, the distant lights of an ambulance, the patter of running feet. The camera is still shaking. This is how I and many others remember November 30th, 2013, and the first attack on peaceful Euromaidan protesters by the state. The vast majority of people who share this memory were not in the square that night, but witnessed the attack through a handful of live videos streamed online and shared on Facebook and Twitter. Many of the people I spoke to also recalled graphic photos of injured protesters as one of the first triggers that brought home that a peaceful protest in the city center had been brutally attacked and dispersed, and that this warranted some kind of response. From that first riot police attack on peaceful protesters in November 2013 to the bloodiest days toward the end of the protest in February 2014, when dozens of people were killed, the visibility of protest events and protesters' actions became crucial. These injustices were made visible online in real time, witnessed by those who were not co-present, and remain available as records of the events to this day. All of this is important because it illustrates how socially mediated visibility contributes to both the outcomes of the protest and the various experiences of its participants. The Euromaidan protest was a visually spectacular event that attracted significant media and public attention, in part due to the extensive use of social media by protesters to capture and publicize their experiences. Ukrainian protesters relied on socially mediated visibility for expression, disclosure, and testimony during the protest through widespread practices of visual and textual documentation, such as live streaming, real-time image sharing, live tweeting, and blogging. This visibility also afforded them opportunities to transform their witnessing practices as they were reporting, recording, and sharing stories about the protest. In the highly visible counter-spectacle of Euromaidan, protesters were able to simultaneously participate in the events, bear witness to them, and witness the mediated testimonies of others, with bodies and technologies augmenting each other.
Thank you. That's great. Why did you choose that passage?
I mean, I think this was probably one of the most emotional moments for me, and also because, I mean, it tells a story, and it's actually a kind of retelling of a real video that is still available, a recording of which is still available on YouTube. But I think it's also because it's such a widely shared collective memory that many people, if you ask them, like when they first started paying attention to the Euromaidan protest, it wasn't when the protest actually started, but it was after this or on this night of when this attack actually happened. And so these images and these live streams played a really important part as a kind of mobilization device. And I think for me, it also signifies the very experience that a lot of people who identify themselves as participants of the Euromaidan protest, like that encompasses a lot of their experiences. And again, I like to tell another story of where I was and what I was doing when the Euromaidan protest actually happened, because I was actually not in Ukraine when it started. I was in New York. Well, I was living in DC, but I was in New York doing a guest lecture for a friend of mine who worked at Columbia Harriman Institute. And she posted a photo of me talking to her class on Twitter, or sorry, on Facebook, and she said, here's Tanya, she's visiting me, talking about internet and media in Ukraine. And one of our mutual friends commented and said, hey, while you're doing like university stuff there, we have a revolution happening. And we said, yes, we know, we're watching it unfolding on social media. And so like, that is really, that experience of like augmented co-presence, of like not physically being there, but still being there somehow emotionally, or, with our time, with our attention. I think that encompasses the experience that so many people had. And actually not just the people who were, say, abroad or in other places in Ukraine, but even some of the people who were part of the protest and who spent part of their time in the square or did other various kind of material things for the protest. But a part of their time, even if it's just a part of their day, was always spent looking at screens and like looking at TweetDeck and all of those other sources that allowed them to kind of keep a hand on what was happening.
So in the spectrum of popular discourse about the relationship between technology and protest, we have, on the one hand, we have total naysayers who like to popularize terms like slacktivism, which I find to be personally incredibly irritating. And on the other side, we have sort of self-styled or people who style commentators as utopian or as believers in some kind of deterministic power of technology. And you, in the framing of your work, you are arguing neither of those things. Instead, you're offering a much more nuanced language for us to consider as a concept for understanding this rather complex relationship. And the primary term you landed on is augmented. And I wonder if you could, I think it's a really helpful way of the many metaphors that we use to try to understand this relationship. Augmented is we use it with technology and our phones and this kind of thing, but what you're talking about is somewhat different. And so I wonder if you could explain for us a little bit about why you landed on augmented as your pivot term, and how it's become useful for you in unpacking these nuances.
No, you've hit the nail on the head, Ivan. I mean, that was one of, I think, the things that myself and a lot of other researchers of internet and society, or internet and humanity, sort of struggle with is, I think we find that we are increasingly lacking the vocabulary to talk about, what that experience is like when digital tools and platforms and the internet as a whole becomes so inseparable from kind of the daily reality of our lives that we can't really even talk about like going online any longer, because it's become kind of a meaningless phrase that doesn't really mean anything, because we don't, like, very few people still actually go anywhere. Like, it's just always there. And it's become also, I think, increasingly evident that we need maybe to make up some new words for this. And for me, this debate was sort of really central to my work when I was working on the research that went into the book, and especially in some of the conversations that we were having among the people who founded and who were kind of part of the community around the Theorizing the Web conference, which was started by my friends Nathan Jurgensen and PJ Ray back in the University of Maryland in 2011, and survives to this day. So apparently lots of people are struggling with these questions of like, how do we talk about this life that is made up of both atoms and bits, and what words can we find to talk about them? And one of the things we came across is that, this division between the real and the virtual, or the physical and the digital, and arguing that one is somehow more real than the other, is just not a useful one. And Nathan actually calls this kind of type of position in digital dualism. He says like it's a made up thing. It's no longer the reality that we live in. And so we found that speaking about experiences, events, sort of certain context as augmented was potentially a helpful way of explaining that they are kind of layers, or they're different threads of the same reality that, as you say, we can talk about them as enmeshing, so coming together in ways that are really difficult to disentangle, or interlacing or interfacing. But I think so some of the metaphors that people use to talk about, the sort of traditional augmented reality that we typically think of when we think of like augmented reality applications, for instance, when you're looking at a physical landscape and then you have digital elements that kind of pop up and that add something to what you're seeing, be it information or extra graphics or whatever it is. And I think my hesitancy with trying to use this term here when I talk about augmented protest or augmented dissent is that in kind of more techie circles, I think augmentation is kind of like seen as this sort of determinist or positivist thing, where like augmented always means better. Right. But I think the problem here is that it doesn't always mean better. It just means it's something different, something that's been extended as a kind of experience. And that it's not just that the digital augments the physical, but also that the physical augments the digital. And something new is created, and you have a qualitatively different experience of protest, or just a different protest event, which is differently mobilized, differently, it happens in a qualitatively different way, and it's remembered also in different ways. And I talk about that as well in the same chapter that I just read from, as to how we remember protests and how do we create histories, right, which is also made very different by the fact that we now have all these records and all these archives. So I think that was where I was trying to go, and I find that I have to kind of talk through this and explain this when I talk to people about the ideas in this book. But I think it then leads to like more in-depth and more useful conversations around how do we talk about this reality that we're living in.
I thought you actually define enmeshed at one point as the experience of the event and its story enmeshed and become one, and in which you're basically saying it's a state of augmented existence, or a similar phrase with entanglement, the entanglement of material and digital elements into a single reality. Mm-hmm. And the other word that you often use to describe this moment is copresence, which is a useful concept, but not necessarily something that people actively understand conceptually. And so I wonder if you could give us a quick definition of copresence, and then I want to move on to some other questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think like the term copresence in itself has been used by other researchers who study protest and mobilization and social movements, because for a long time, especially in the kind of classic literature on social movements, the feeling was that it's really important for people to come together physically and to feel like they're part of a community or part of something bigger in order for mobilization to happen and in order for protests to achieve their outcomes. But I think what we've started to see is that copresence can also be achieved through different means, and that you don't necessarily need to physically be in the same space as other people, or not only, like that's not the only option. You can also feel co-present, and I think the word feel is important here because technology isn't just like wires and bytes, it's also affect and it's also emotion, and it is possible to change how you feel about something if you're looking at a live stream and not necessarily just being like physically in a space where something is happening. So that idea of being present in a place or in an event, and also feeling like you are there together with other people, is, I think, what I really want to get across, is that it is possible for that to happen in networked ways and not just in material ways. And I think like here we could perhaps allude to, the idea that drives Global Voices is that you can have a network newsroom where people don't sit in the same office, and where people meet very rarely as a group, and there's still a feeling that we are a group and that we're working on something together and that we're doing something important. And there's also a feeling of intimacy and friendship, and like all of these things are happening. So I think that idea is maybe not entirely alien to our community.
No, I think intuitively it's something we understand, but I also always find that it's when you land upon a term that captures its essence, it's clarifying. It's a clarifying moment. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. Among the popular narratives about the relationship between protest and our digital lives has, in the past few years, we've come to hear that digital media are good for organizing and bringing people together, but they're not. But potentially less helpful for sustaining deep networks over time and for making long-term change. That's a claim that we've heard in many protest movements, that they foster shallow ties, not deep ties. They allow us to avoid doing the hard work of building actual networks and teaching people how to build actual movements that lead to political change over a longer time scale. In reading your book, I didn't get the sense that you would entirely agree with that statement, at least in the case of the Ukrainian protests. And you break down the book into a number of different chapters that focus on different aspects of the relationship, one of which is protest witnessing, another which is protest organizing and networking, and a third of which is protest framing and information sharing. And those are also very helpful kind of separations or segmentations of what happens in the space and time of protest, to understand that not everything is just one large digital agglomeration. Mm-hmm. Now that we're in the history phase of the Ukrainian protests and reflecting back upon them, where do you fall on this, on the idea of whether there's some kind of necessary understanding of how the digital and the protest space actually do work together? And are we learning? Are we changing? Is that still a valid framing?
I think I would say that it really is heavily context dependent, and that we can make comments about digital media or particular platforms or like networked structures as being more useful for quick mobilization and what my colleague Paolo Garbato calls collective effervescence. Like, they're certainly really good for generating those moments, especially if there are charismatic people who can generate those moments or drive attention, or there are some catchy slogans and stuff like that. But that by default, I would say that I would agree with the statement that by default, digital media in and of themselves do not guarantee sustainability of movements or political change, but also I don't think we should expect them to. And I would roll back and say it really is about people and what opportunities or for action or limitations people see when they have access to these tools as part of their arsenal. And then it's also dependent on the context in which a particular protest takes place, right? Is it taking place in a somewhat dysfunctional but mostly free space, of a somewhat faltering democracy that we could say Ukraine was? I mean, it was maybe on the brink of falling into authoritarianism, but not yet. Whereas, in a country like Russia, where it has been said that it's a full-blown authoritarian regime, even though it has some token characteristics of a democracy. You could call it a managed democracy, or you could call it a networked authoritarian state. The stakes are really different. And, if you're just getting access to these tools that you can experiment with and kind of play around with and decide and explore the opportunities, you get a very different picture. If in another setting, it's also for you, like those tools are also useful for you to protect yourself and to secure your survival, and where you're fighting against that in addition to trying to get your protest claims, and and that also means that they kind of start to be rolled into one. So I think in Ukraine it's a really interesting it's a really interesting case where I wouldn't presume to like extrapolate to other countries, because in Ukraine, I think there was a very unique situation where the protest came to an end. There was a kind of visible marker of success with, the president running off and like the government undergoing some turnover, even though a lot of the people who came in were still kind of of the old guard, even though they professed to be somewhat of a reforming mindset. But then very quickly we had the war that started with the occupation of Crimea and the events in eastern Ukraine and the takeover of some of those regions, where there almost was no period of like for the civil society, and those networks that were built during Euromaidan, they had no like time to rest. They had to immediately regroup and to start using those same networks to do something different, to provide aid to veterans, or not immediately, but like to support the military and volunteer battalions, to support internally displaced persons. So it was almost like one crisis turned into another crisis, and that may, I think, at least in part, influenced that they saw opportunities to support and sustain those networks, and then also to transform some of them into groups and organizations that went and started reforming some of the government institutions and some of the trying to dismantle some of the corruption. Others continued to offer volunteer support to the kind of the conflict and everything that stemmed from that. And ironically, we see that some of these structures are surviving to this day, where today when there's a shortage of ventilators because of the COVID pandemic, we see the same people and the same groups mobilize. I mean, they never stopped mobilizing, but they're now mobilizing to raise money for additional ventilators and oxygen tanks that they can give to people who need them because there's no space in hospitals. So it's a really, I think, unique situation, and it's probably, you will find that it's unique in each particular country where they have their own sequence of events. But I think in Ukraine that really has informed I guess the affordances that people continue to see, and that's why those mobilizing structures remain so viable still to this day. But I don't think that would necessarily be true in a different country, or that it would necessarily be just because they use these particular digital media platforms. So I think context is really, really important.
Yeah, I think I took that away from your writing. I wasn't trying to imply that you were offering an alternative universal theory, and in the sense, what you're arguing for is the lack of a universal theory, and I think that's a healthy and helpful framing for this issue. That also
it sounds like a terrible move for an academic researcher, and yet here we are.
Well, you could, the universal theory could be there is no universal theory, but there is that whole universe in the theorizing space.
But can you put it on
the theory of everything, people?
Oh, but can you put that on a T-shirt, right?
Exactly. But you might have to use the back. So. And speaking of the back, your last chapter is about Russia, and which you unpack for us how an alternative universe in which protest movements experiencing a different set of conditions in which the regime is more experienced in the ways of augmentation, force a different set of conditions and a different set of outcomes. And maybe this is a good time for you to explain a little bit about what that experience was, and then and some of the choices that Russian protesters made given their own specific context.
Yeah, I think it's, the chapter on Russia, I mean, it wasn't part of the original bigger research project, which was entirely devoted to Ukraine, but I felt that I was really interested in seeing how, the activists and protesters in Russia almost saw a lot of the same potential or opportunities for action, how they used it in really different ways. And again, obviously, a lot of this is informed by, the fact that the state was much more coercive and much more repressive, and so they had to deal with that in addition to trying to deal with making their protest claims visible. But I think the other thing that I saw, and I think it's becoming more and more visible in Russia, maybe now in Belarus to some extent, is that I think by that point, and certainly by today, both the activists and the protesters and the state, in part, those people who are actually maybe in part writing the legislation and making the decisions, that they have actually gotten much closer to this, to accepting this idea, that yes, this is a hybrid reality and that it's really impossible to separate the digital and the physical. So we must reckon with them as part of the same whole, kind of as part of the same reality. And so it was interesting to me, for instance, to see that in Russia, the activists are incredibly aware of the power, of the potential for visibility on social media, but they also understand the risks that brings. And I know that in a lot of authoritarian countries, the protesters are much more aware of the risks that visibility brings. That's why we have projects like Witness that educate you on how to responsibly capture videos and photos from protest rallies, because there is an inherent danger in protesters being identified. And like certainly, even in the US, we saw that, from the events of the past year and a half, that people there also very quickly realized that, yeah, actually, it's not a good idea to for your face to be captured on video. But in Russia, the police are doing that on purpose. And so, yes, they have physical attacks and where they arrest protesters during protest rallies, but they also film you, and they also have a network of CCTV cameras, and then they also now are using increasingly facial recognition technology to identify people post-protests and then come and arrest them or come and detain them. So it was really interesting to me to see that activists in Russia are aware of the power of visibility, and they are very strategic about what they make visible, but they're also very, very particular about what they make invisible. And I think, that is equally important, because they understand that some things have more power when they're visible, and other things need to remain invisible because otherwise they won't work, or they'll put too many people at risk, or, and instead they then also kind of subvert the thing. It's like, well, if the state is filming us, we're also going to film them, when they do those little drone flyovers over the property of top officials and oligarchs. Like, that is also using that same power of visibility to say, well, look, you can surveil us, but we can also surveil you. And it's going to be very, very powerful if we just show this thing that nobody has really ever seen, so that people understand what is actually going on. So I think it's really interesting to see how they're much more aware of the variety of options they have, and that they make very complex decisions, and how they choose to make some things really transparent and visible, and also try and educate people in the process about digital security and privacy, and then choose to leave some things aside and actually use more ephemeral platforms and disappearing messages and encryption to preserve the safety of their community. But of course, the state is also catching on to that. So that's the next chapter of the story, so to speak.
I was in Russia in 2012, not long after the 2011, the big Bolotnaya protests, and I met with some of the activists. And at the time, they had chosen, that particular group of people that I was talking to had chosen what they described as a radical transparency for their activism. And in order to be included in the organizing committee groups, you had to basically be prepared to reveal your entire life. You had to assume that anything that you were saying and doing was going to be documented and captured in some way, and that the Russian security forces were strong enough that they could physically surveil you, they could digitally surveil you, but paradoxically, by choosing a radical transparency, you also gain power. You said, my face is already available to you. You can see everything, and still I hold this position, which is what Navalny has said from the very beginning. Navalny's power comes from this position of radical transparency. And of course, to your point, there are still nuances. There's still a need at times, or attempts to create private spaces or ephemeral spaces for strategizing. But I found that reaction to that kind of, I'm all in. Like my entire body is in this, and there's nothing else to be done but to completely engage and to take all of those risks on for the cause that I'm advocating as an effective and interesting countermeasure to the proposition of universal surveillance.
Right. And I think, to some extent it's like, well, like part of being like a visible activist or a visible leader in a situation like this, it almost requires you to say, well, I understand the risks, but I'm prepared to take them. But it's also about trying to protect maybe other members of your community. And I think at some point, like I think they are incredibly aware of the risks, both physical and kind of reputational and whatever, because they try as much as possible, to be very transparent about their finances, about their donations, about how they organize things. But also you could almost always, it's like, well, there's a number of people who are at the top and who are visible. And then there's a lot more people who are in the networks, in the regional kind of hubs, who are not visible. And there's a reason, right? So yes, there is a visible regional presence in every region, but there are also a bunch of anonymous admins who are running the Telegram channels and stuff like that. And we saw something very similar in Belarus as well, because I think there's this really keen awareness that visibility is strategic and it's used strategically, but it's also outcome driven, right? So you're doing this for a specific reason, and you understand that there are risks, and you need to account for those risks.
That's really fascinating. I wonder if we can open this up to others, because I know that we have a number of friends and colleagues and others who are in the chat and who might be interested in saying something. Let's see if anybody would like to add questions. So here's the first question from our colleague Philip Nobel. What are the main differences between the Ukrainian and Belarusian experiences of streaming online protests?
Well, that's an easy question. That's the next book, right?
Exactly.
Ironically, earlier today, I was at a workshop where we're working on a special issue devoted to Belarus and the Belarusian protests, and there were some really fascinating contributions from people there. I think, to me, and obviously, take this with a grain of salt, because I didn't look closely, apart from being stuck to Twitter and Telegram and watching everything that's been happening. I think it's really interesting to me from a physical standpoint that the Belarusian protests were much less centralized and they were much more dispersed. So there wasn't a particular protest camp. There were some attempts to gather in specific places in Minsk, but there were also over 100 regional protests that happened quite regularly, and some of them continue to happen to this day. So to me, that says something really interesting, because in Ukraine, yes, there were regional Maidans, but there weren't hundreds of them. And there was still this really, the beating heart was still the square, The other thing to me is, I think, again, the Belarusians' sort of attitude to social media use is they understand that there's probably some surveillance happening. If it's a public Telegram chat, there's likely that there's some kind of law enforcement presence there or whatever. So it's really, and if you really want super private things, you need to have burner phones, encrypted messages, Signal, disappearing Telegram chats. So I think there's a much more, at least among the activists, there's a much more keener awareness of the limitations as well as the opportunities. But I think also they're realizing that they wield incredible power by trying to focus people's attention to those channels which are sharing information from across Belarus, because there's no other place where you can see all of that information in one space. Those streams of information, videos, evidence, that's incredible. And I think that's why, because obviously the state media aren't showing the protests, or they're showing specific things. whereas it's all in the Telegram channels, all of the little reports being kind of pulled in and aggregated. And I think that was really a really impressive thing for me to see. But again, I think there was a much keener awareness of the fact that, yes, there will be crackdowns and that we need to try and protect people, and that we also need to think about alternatives. You know, if somebody's phone is taken away from them, how will the network function? If the internet is shut down, which happened, right, which didn't actually happen in Ukraine, really, what are we going to do? And I was really pleased to see that, you know, that hybrid thinking was very much present, where in moments where the internet was shut down, including mobile internet, people just printed a bunch of posters and glued them in podъезды, you know, and like in the homes. And they also shared like USB flash drives with digital versions of the posters, which contained all the information. So you could see that thinking that, well, this is an enmeshed protest. This is a hybrid protest. So we're going to try and do things every which way and something will stick. So I think it was really heartening to see that, because to me that just signifies that they're fully aware of what protests look like now.
Really interesting. Let's take the next question. This is from Elaine Summers. There's so much censorship online nowadays. How do you see this as affecting the future of digital protest?
I mean, it's not affecting the future. It's affecting the present. I mean, I think we're seeing this happen across the world. I mean, you know, Russia is obviously like always held up in my corner of academia as the sort of example where, you know, they basically pressure platforms to take down protest, anything protest related. And then, you know, if platforms don't comply, they block them, or they threaten them, or they throttle them, or they fine them, which has happened to multiple platforms already. But the problem is also that I think the big platforms are also incredibly lacking in that contextual knowledge, and, you know, where they might know what to block and what constitutes hate speech or whatnot in, say, the English language speaking space. I mean, that's a big if. But when we go to very specific national contexts, you know, anywhere from Myanmar to Colombia to Azerbaijan, it's just not there. And so they will either block stuff that the governments ask them to block, or they'll block something if it's reported by a bunch of people, or they'll block something if they think it constitutes suspicious activity. Maybe it's just, you know, a Twitter storm or a hashtag or whatever. And they have no awareness of what the situation actually is, who has more power, like what is going on. And I think that's a big problem. And I know multiple voices are addressing this problem. You know, we've seen some of the more recent conversations happening around Myanmar after all the leaks from Facebook and the departure of Sophie Zhang and all of her disclosures about how hard she fought for attention to all of these cases of attempts at mobilization or attempts to stifle mobilization, which were just ignored. And then, you know, more recently to this campaign to support Palestinian internet users who've been wronged by platforms quite a lot in the most recent conflict and in their mass mobilization, where a lot of them were just silenced. So I think, you know, this is an issue that is already a problem. And I think platforms need to reckon with this very carefully, and they need to listen to digital rights advocates, because otherwise, you know, I think it's just going to continue being an issue if platforms say, oh, we don't have the resources to support this.
Yeah, and as we've discussed before, it may be the case that whatever path the platforms take, there's going to be harms, right? If they decide to aggressively censor or restrict one side, then there's always a backlash, and sometimes those consequences are visible and sometimes they're not. But,
exactly, and sometimes they're only visible when it's too late, right? Which is unfortunate. But I think, yeah, because the platforms are unlikely to take a very highly contextual and nuanced approach. They will want a solution that'll work for everything, which obviously we know is not a solution that will work.
Right. Scale is not always the answer for everything. I believe we have a few more questions. This one's from Arzu. Perhaps taking Philip's question a bit further, do you see significant difference in the extent of crackdown used in places like Belarus this past year versus protests in Ukraine almost 6 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think to begin with, I think, we can talk both about crackdown on sort of physical crackdown on protesters, and also the pressure or repression of digital space. And I think in Ukraine, there was very little repression or pressure of digital space, just because, well, the Ukrainian government didn't know much about the internet, and they didn't even think it was a threat. And when they got to understanding that it was almost too late. When they sent that silly warning message to people in mid-January 2014, it was like they tried to use mass text messages, and it would look very funny. I think they just resorted to physical crackdown because that was really the only way they saw to pressure the protesters to stop. In Belarus, obviously it's really hard to theorize because we know so little about what goes on behind the scenes, but I think there is a much keener understanding, even very basic, of the fact that shutting down the internet is important because it disables certain networks, certain ways of communication, certain mobilization structures. It disables also the recording of evidence, which I think was really important to Belarusian authorities. And that's why, they've now passed all these laws where journalists can't go and cover unsanctioned protest rallies. Nobody, basically you can't record images of police, etc. So there's all this. It's very clear that they are more aware of the connection between the physical and the digital. And so cracking down on people, and obviously, the most worrying thing is still all the people who've been killed, tortured, imprisoned. But also, they're now shutting down websites, and they're arresting whole teams of whole newsrooms of journalists. So I think their approach to crackdown is a hybrid approach, because they understand that both digital and physical are important.
So we have a question from Asteris. Platforms also haven't responded to the targeting of HRDs in significant ways in recent years. For example, by actively protecting them from mass reporting campaigns or even responding to verification requests.
Yeah, that has certainly been one of the things that platforms have been criticized for. And I have to say, I agree with this criticism. I think that if only they protected HRDs as much as they protect politicians, we would have been in a much better place. But I think that they're almost like their gut reaction is to like, oh well, we need to treat everybody equally. But like, no, different people have different threat models, and different people face different risks. And this is obviously along the lines of, are you a human rights defender or not? It's also along the lines of, are you a woman? Do you identify as a woman or a man or a person of color? Like, there are so many inequalities that, in terms of like how much abuse you can get, or like how much in danger you are, that perpetuate themselves online just as they do offline. And I think platforms just also feel really sensitive about whenever they're like the things that they have tried to do in order to, improve their comment moderation or reporting or complaint systems, when those are criticized as not adequate enough, or not adequate enough for specific people with specific threat models, their gut reaction is to say, no, but like we've tried to do the best we can, and then they just deny that mass reporting campaigns work. And it's obviously really hard because, it keeps happening, they keep denying it, and then we're just left with like, well, yes, some people are still in a lot of danger, and they still get a lot of threats, and they're traumatized, in addition to, all the other risks they face. So I think, that is a battle that we'll have to keep fighting, because I don't think it's a sustainable situation.
And also because people don't really trust the platforms in the main, or believe them. So even if they are actually doing a good job, it's kind of, when a statement is issued, there's a lot of skepticism about it. And unfortunately, platforms have maybe offered not the whole story often enough that those that skepticism is often warranted,
Exactly.
making it very complicated. We have a few more questions, I believe. This one's from Philip Stoyanovsky. Do protesters in the ex-USSR use gaming networks to overcome the spiral of silence in media censorship? Outside of the region, the Russians are famous as the main populations of Counter-Strike gaming servers.
I will have to say I don't know because I haven't studied this issue. I do know that like gaming chats and like platforms like Discord or Twitch are quite popular, and that activists in other countries definitely use them to try and get around censorship. And I think it's great because to me, like that again, really opens up this discussion of affordances, right? It's a potential opportunity to have us to see this as a space where you can engage freely in discussions and organizing and whatever. It's not what the platforms were designed for, but it's what we can use them for. So I think to me that is another example of like expansive thinking. And this reminds me of like the more recent, like when Clubhouse came around, immediately you had all of these like Chinese discussion groups springing up on it, where we were like, wow, there's no censorship here. This is amazing. I mean, that ended very quickly, of course, but
it sure did.
Right. And then I think similar things we've seen happen with other platforms when they come into a new country and the government doesn't know about them or doesn't know what to do with them. There's a moment when people flock to them and they're free, and then they're not.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. And I think, this is potentially like, I know some people are probably doing research on this, so it would be really exciting to explore like who is doing research in this area. They could probably tell many fascinating stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the endlessly proliferating space of social media platforms or ways of digital modes of conversation and expression. We can always expect another and another and another to appear. I believe we have a final question from the group, and then we're going to move to a slightly different topic and wrap up. Philip, this is, with more sovereign internets likely to pop up, do you think this might signal limitations for online protests? Thinking mostly about Russia here.
Well, I mean, given that we've just said that protest is never entirely online, that it's hybrid, I think this is probably also a good time to, bring up the work that our friend Ethan has been doing in terms of, are there alternatives to the internet as we know it and to social media or like the dominant social media platforms? And I think, I know Ethan's project is still in progress, but I think the answer is definitely yes. And I think, the like balkanization or sovereignization did not begin yesterday. It's been a kind of a growing trend and a process that started years ago. And in part, it stems from the fact that, the internet is really hard to govern because it doesn't map onto national borders, and therefore jurisdictions are troublesome. So it's no wonder that nations or nation states want to have their own sovereign internets, even if they only talk about them in cybersecurity terms. But I think my answer is that, activists will probably find creative ways of building their own internets that aren't necessarily sovereign and that maybe are a kind of parallel space or parallel spaces that connect people to whoever else they want to connect to and that don't necessarily operate on the same protocols or even in the same space or the same form as the sovereign internets. So look, I think, the future is limitless. I'm really excited to learn what those internets might look like.
Well, the future may be limitless, but the focus of your research is not. So what are you working on now? And this is our comment.
So I think I give away a little bit of my current interest in the sort of final part of the book where I talk about the interest in how increasingly we're seeing, especially in countries where there's more pressure on digital spaces, that people are thinking about their digital rights and their rights to free expression and their right to protest as becoming part of the same space and part of the same set of problems. And so I'm really interested in looking deeper into this idea of what makes a digital or networked citizen, and how we can think about augmented citizenship, where, you know, the sphere of our rights and obligations doesn't just extend to things that we typically think of citizens doing, but also, you know, it also encompasses those digital rights. And of course, looking at how the state is trying to take control over that, but also in looking at the creative ways that different activists and different rights groups and different countries are trying to define digital citizenship for themselves and sort of retain kind of that agency. So I think it's a really interesting space. It's a very promising space. And, you know, as soon as I have a little more time to think about what the next book is going to be called, I will let you know.
Well, I look forward to reading it. Tanya, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, really enlightening. I encourage everybody to read it, and you can get a copy from the publisher, and Tanya can help direct. I'd also like to note that you should come and read globalvoices.org. You can read Tanya, you can read many of our other editors and writers from all over the world in over 30 languages. You can sign up for our daily and weekly newsletters. You can follow us at Gobal Voices on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can join us as a writer and translator. So we're excited to meet you, and we're excited to hear your thoughts as well. And once again, Tanya, thank you so much. And any final words? Or
yeah, I just want to say thank you, Ivan, because you know, I forgot to tell the story, but writing about the protests in Ukraine was actually how I joined Global Voices. So back in December 2013, I wrote my first Global Voices post. And, you know, this is why we're here, and this is why we're having this conversation. So also, I think the only thing that remains for me is to thank Global Voices for, you know, for being such a nurturing community, and for bringing together all kinds of people to have all kinds of conversations that, you know, sometimes result in books, other times result in special projects, but always result in sustaining a huge community of like-minded people who always have fun together, no matter if they meet through ADOMs or through bits.
Mm-hmm. Or in some other hybrid reality.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending and for your wonderful questions.